Japanese bombs exploded with terrifying blasts, the concussions temporarily rendering both patients and staff in the small hospital beside Clark Field Air Base deaf. The air was thick with smoke, and dirt and debris rained down in a giant pool as the drone of aero engines faded into the distance. Survivors carefully threaded their way through the wreckage of the hospital, searching for anyone left alive, and confronting appalling scenes of carnage and suffering. Quote, "Only one small section of my ward remains standing," recalled Second Lieutenant Rita Palmer, a member of the American Army Nursing Corps running the hospital in the Philippines. Part of the roof had been blown into the jungle. There were mangled bodies under the ruins. A blood-stained hand stuck up through a pile of scrap. Unquote. The nurses staggered about the wreckage, confronting the ghastly reality of a war that had suddenly been thrust upon the sleepy Philippine islands. Quote, "Arms and legs had been ripped off and flung among the rubbish," recalled Palmer. "Some of the mangled torsos were impossible to identify." Unquote. The nurses and medical orderlies attacked the rubble and debris with their hands, trying to get at the patients trapped beneath. The bombing had stopped, recalled Palmer, but the air was rent by the awful screams of the new wounded and the dying. Trees were still crashing in the jungle, and when one nearby fell on the remaining segment of tin roof, it sounded like shell fire. Many of the nurses had been injured by flying shrapnel during the raid. Palmer recalled seeing one of the nurses, Rosemary Hogan, quote, being helped from the ward. Blood streamed from her face and shoulder. She looked ghastly. Palmer herself had several injuries. "I remember coming to and having long beams of the roof over me and struggling out from under those," she later recalled. "I have no idea how long I was knocked out. I could breathe all right, but one finger of one hand was incapacitated. I didn't even know about the piece of shrapnel in my chest for several hours. It didn't penetrate my lung. I had shrapnel in my legs too." Unquote. General Douglas MacArthur would suffer a military humiliation at the hands of the Japanese as great as that suffered by British Lieutenant General Arthur Percival when he lost Malaya and Singapore to the Japanese. For both the United States and Great Britain, the mismanaged campaigns to defend the Philippines and Malaya from an aggressive Japanese army ended up as a catalogue of disasters, regrets, and missed opportunities. In the Philippines, and in similar circumstances to Singapore and Hong Kong, service women were to find themselves needlessly abandoned to a cruel enemy when the battle was inevitably lost. Rita Palmer was typical of many young army nurses who were sent to the Philippines just before war erupted in the Far East. She had enlisted and been commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Nursing Corps in March 1941, just 9 months before the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Hailing from rural New England, Palmer viewed the war primarily as an opportunity to travel for free. Quote, "After several months, an opportunity to transfer to the Philippines came along, and being young and eager to see the world, I volunteered." Unquote. A sense of adventure brought most of the army nurses to the Philippines, which appeared exotic compared with life stateside. Another nurse who went west for similar reasons as Palmer was Madeline Ullum. Ullum was from Nebraska, and she joined the U.S. Army in 1938. Stationed in Washington, D.C., quote, "I worked on the wards and in the operating room," she recalled. Boredom led her to apply for an overseas posting. "I asked for the Philippines because it was furthest away from Washington." Ullum was based at Sternberg General Hospital in Manila when war broke out in December 1941. In total, there were 85 Army nurses in the Philippines during the battle, 66 of whom were ultimately captured and imprisoned by the Japanese. A further 16 U.S. Navy nurses were also captured in the Philippines and on the island of Guam in the Pacific, meaning that a total of 82 American servicewomen ended up in Japanese prison camps. Opportunities had existed for some time before the American capitulation to evacuate these young women, but none was ever seized, and they were abandoned by their country to an enemy well known for his brutality and appalling treatment of females. Lieutenant Palmer and 5 other nurses arrived in Manila on the 23rd of October and were stationed at Fort Stotensburg, 60 miles north of the capital and close to Clark Field, a major Army airbase. The hospital beside Clark Field was bombed on the first day of the war when Japanese aircraft managed to knock out most of the American bombers that were lined up on the ground in a surprise attack. The Japanese 11th Air Fleet caught 2 full squadrons of B-17 flying fortresses sitting on their dispersals, and American fighter escorts that were preparing to take off. Quote, "The horror of that first afternoon of war is burned in my memory," said Palmer. "The dead, the dying, the dismembered who filled every inch of our small hospital are epitomized by me by a legless 16-year-old who had lied about his age to get into the army." Unquote. Clark Field was left in a shambles, with every one of the B-17s reduced to a burning pile of scrap metal. General MacArthur's Far East Air Force ceased to exist a few days later as the remaining aircraft were knocked out of the sky by superior Japanese fighters, leaving his forces unprotected against large-scale bombing and strafing. The Japanese began their invasion of the vast Philippine Islands group on the 8th of December, with elements from Lieutenant General Masaharu Homma's 14th Army landing on Bataan Island on the northern coast of Luzon. 2 days later, more Japanese came ashore at Camiguin Island and at Vigan, Apari and Gonzaga in northern Luzon, followed by another landing at Legazpi in southern Luzon on the 12th. On the 19th of December, the island of Mindanao was attacked, and the U.S. Asiatic Fleet withdrew after Japanese air attacks had devastated its important naval facilities at Cavite. General Homma's main attack was launched on the 22nd of December, when over 43,000 Japanese troops, with supporting tanks and artillery, entered Luzon's Lingayen Gulf. In total, 120,000 Japanese faced a joint American-Filipino force of 150,000 troops, but the Filipinos, who made up the majority of MacArthur's manpower, were badly trained, ill-equipped, and largely inexperienced. As in Hong Kong and Malaya, the Japanese soldiers were experienced China War veterans who enjoyed complete air superiority and armored support. MacArthur's deputy commander, Lieutenant General Jonathan M. Wainwright, was unable to prevent the Japanese from landing, and forces under Major General G. M. Parker that were supposed to block the road to Manila were dispersed by strong enemy assaults. The Japanese began to drive towards Manila virtually unopposed by organized resistance, as thousands of refugees fled before it and Japanese aircraft bombed and strafed at will. In Manila, the nurses had their hands full dealing with casualties evacuated from the front lines and those caught in Japanese bombing raids, which were increasing in intensity. Quote, "There were so many casualties they were putting the litters out in the courtyard," recalled Lieutenant Ullum. The strain on the medical staff was enormous. Quote, "Whenever there was a lull in the bombing, we'd put a blanket down on the floor of the OR and sleep until the casualties started coming in again." Unquote. As Japanese forces approached the city at the end of December, both Clark Field and Manila itself were evacuated. "We left the city at 2 a.m. in a field ambulance," said Ullum, dodging the craters. Most of the Allied forces surrendered or were overrun and captured as the Japanese drove away from the beaches towards the Filipino capital. The main American unit, the U.S. Philippine Division, moved into the field to cover the withdrawal of units into the Bataan Peninsula beside Manila Bay. MacArthur activated a pre-war plan to defend only Bataan and Corregidor Island in the bay on the 26th of December, no one quite believing that the situation had got so bad so quickly. It looked as though the mighty United States was going to lose the Philippines entirely. 2 army nurses had already been captured by the Japanese when Camp Hay was overrun 200 miles north of Manila on the 27th of December. MacArthur ordered 50 army nurses and 1 from the Navy out of Manila into the Bataan Peninsula shortly afterwards, concerned lest they fall into enemy hands. He also desperately needed trained medics, male or female, as the casualties continued to mount daily. They worked tirelessly treating wounded American and Filipino troops trapped by the Japanese advance. Throughout January 1942, the Japanese launched limited assaults into the Bataan perimeter, which was held by a mixture of Filipino and American forces. MacArthur's army had nowhere to go and was being slowly worn down by constant combat, Supplies were running out because the US Navy was largely unable to get ships into the trapped army, and Japanese air power ruled out any attempt to evacuate the army from the Bataan Peninsula, as the British had done so successfully at Dunkirk in 1940. President Franklin D. Roosevelt eventually ordered MacArthur out, much against his wishes, and General Wainwright assumed command on the 12th of March, knowing that he would eventually wind up as a prisoner of war. Roosevelt's reasoning behind this decision was that although the army was doomed, MacArthur and his staff, derisively known as the Bataan Gang on arrival in Australia, could still play an important role in the American fightback. Allowing them to languish in some Japanese prison camp was never seriously contemplated. Unfortunately, it did not look too good when MacArthur and a few senior officers were given free rides to safety courtesy of the US Navy, and over 60 service nurses were abandoned to their fates. Beginning on the 28th of March, Homer launched a series of strong attacks against the Allied line at Bataan, and despite fierce resistance, the Japanese managed to break through on the 3rd of April, with many Allied units being overrun in the process. The American and Filipino soldiers were badly malnourished as their food supplies had evaporated, and they were riddled with tropical diseases as medical supplies had been used up too. Exhausted from the prolonged fighting, many thought that surrender would be a blessed relief, not realizing the horrors the Japanese had waiting for them. When it became clear that Bataan would capitulate, the nurses were evacuated on the 8th of April 1942 to Corregidor Island, quite literally as the Japanese were within a few hundred yards of the field hospitals at Bataan. One group of about 10 nurses boarded a coconut husk boat and headed for Corregidor at the mouth of Manila Bay, as in the confusion of the evacuation they had missed the last Navy ships out of Bataan. 5 minutes after we left, the dock blew up, said Ullum, who recalled that some wag in the boat remarked dryly, "Nothing like burning your bridges after you cross them." When they landed on Corregidor, it was in the midst of an air raid. Quote, "A truck came, never stopped, just slowed down and scooped us up." Unquote. The Bataan Peninsula surrendered on the 10th of April 1942. Decades before, the Corps of Engineers had excavated an extensive tunnel system beneath Corregidor Island, and into this labyrinthine world poured the retreating American and Filipino forces from the mainland. The island was a U.S. Army Coast Artillery post, and the anti-aircraft regiments stationed above shot down dozens of Japanese aircraft during the siege. The American and Filipino Scouts garrison was augmented by many individuals and units that had managed to get out of Bataan before the surrender and cross the 2 miles of water to the island safely. About 11,000 troops were outnumbered many times over by the Japanese occupying Bataan, who had begun immediate preparations for an amphibious invasion of the island once they had pounded it into submission with bombers. The army doctors and nurses were immediately put to work at the underground hospital that was located inside the Malinta tunnel. Quote, "They had triple bunk beds where we worked," recalled Ullum. The nurses slept in a small lateral tunnel. Lieutenant Palmer, whose group of nurses was also evacuated to Corregidor, recalled 18-hour shifts and little sleep. Medical supplies eventually ran out after 5 months after siege. "We were scared in a way," said Palmer. "We didn't have time to think about anything." In March 1942, the U.S. Navy managed to get a few submarines through to the north side of Corregidor Island. They brought with them orders for General Wainwright, mail for the troops, and more weapons. They left with an assortment of important passengers and cargo. The Filipino president, Manuel Quezon, and his government had been evacuated to the island by the Americans, along with hundreds of top government officials. Many of these were given safe passage aboard the submarines, along with the highly placed American officers. Gold and silver bullion was also evacuated, along with stacks of important records. The nurses, however, were not included in this roster. They were evidently deemed expendable, with male officials going instead of the women. They remained at their posts, working in the hellish conditions of the Malinta tunnel until the bitter end. The Japanese slowly wore the island's defences down, eventually knocking out all of the coastal defence guns. On the night of the 5th to 6th of May 1942, 2 Japanese infantry battalions stormed ashore on the northeast of the island in a surprise amphibious assault and quickly overwhelmed ferocious American resistance to establish a beachhead. Homer had his beachhead rapidly expanded by landing more troops, along with light tanks and artillery. The defenders were then slowly pushed back towards the island's highest point, Malinta Hill, beneath which the nurses still worked feverishly to treat hundreds of battle casualties in the stuffy and dusty concrete tunnels. Aerial bombing and shell fire from artillery blasted the area above the Malinta tunnel. Inside the hospital, the dust was so intense in the operating room we had to put wet gauze over the patients' mouths, recalled Lieutenant Ullum. On the 6th of May, Wainwright asked General Homer for terms. 2 days later, Wainwright formally surrendered all Allied forces in the Philippines to the Japanese. The American defense of the Philippines had lasted fully 6 months longer than General Percival's efforts to defend Malaya and Singapore. But the result was never in doubt once MacArthur had ordered his forces into the Bataan Peninsula. Japanese soldiers first entered the Malinta Tunnel complex on the 7th of May. They took the chief medical superintendent and 9 nurses outside, where they photographed them. For the nurses, it was the first time they had been above ground for many weeks. It was a chaotic picture that greeted them. Quote, "There were bodies, Japanese and American, everywhere. The ground was drenched in blood, and great big green flies were everywhere," said a horrified Ullum. The Japanese then ushered the nurses back inside, where they were forced to continue tending to the wounded and sick for a further 6 weeks after the surrender. The Japanese soon began to implement their usual regime of deliberate shortages. "We were given half rations, and then they were cut to half again," recalled Ullum. Complaining was useless. The Japanese dealt with any demands for improved conditions with extreme brutality. One doctor, an army captain, asked for more food for his patients, who were being systematically starved along with the medical personnel. The Japanese response was recorded by Ullum and the other nurses. Quote, "He was taken outside. We heard 2 shots fired. No one ever saw him again." Unquote. In July 1942, the 68 American nurses were put onto a ship, along with 1,000 patients, and sent back to Manila. For the nurses, a new phase of their captivity was about to begin in a civilian internment camp. It was by no means certain at that stage that all of them would survive the war. Margaret Ullum was to sum up the next 3 years' imprisonment thus: it was beriberi, starvation, scurvy. Many of the Allied civilians captured at the fall of the Philippines were herded onto the campus of the University of Santo Tomas, located on the outskirts of Manila. It had originally been established in 1611. About 4,000 American, British, and other men, women, and children, along with a few Germans and Italians, were imprisoned in the makeshift internment camp, initially under Japanese consular service officials rather than the military. The first 2 years were fairly pleasant, recalled Lieutenant Rita Palmer, an American nurse captured on Corregidor in 1942. The Japanese commandant was a civilian who for many years lived in Manila. The inmates represented all of pre-war white society in the Philippines, and most of the internees were middle-class professionals or skilled workers. They included bank presidents, missionaries, teachers, company vice presidents and their wives, teenagers from private schools, veterans from the Spanish-American War, newspaper editors and reporters, doctors, military nurses, housewives, children, musicians, writers, prostitutes, engineers, chemists, plumbers, electricians, administrators, society belles and Rotarians, college professors, clergymen, nuns and priests, and even professional entertainers. The large group of American nurses who had been captured on Corregidor Island and elsewhere in the Philippines were initially kept segregated from the main prison population at Santo Tomas for 7 weeks after their arrival there. "They thought we were dangerous because we'd taken care of the military," remembered Lieutenant Madeline Ullum. Eventually these military prisoners were released from isolation and became fully integrated into camp life. The nurses were required by the Japanese to work for 4 hours a day in the small camp hospital. Quote, "Everyone capable of working was expected to do so, and in fact was assigned some task." Unquote. the prisoners lived in small families, as they came to call the tight-knit little groups that bunked together, ate together, and worked together. Santo Tomas Camp was filthy when the hundreds of prisoners were initially herded inside. Quote, "The books in the library, furniture, and woodwork were alive with bedbugs. We soon learned not to be embarrassed or disgusted if one was seen crawling on someone's shoulder. It was unavoidable," Palmer noted. The Americans immediately set to work trying to improve the conditions inside the camp, primarily to stave off epidemic infections. Quote, "Weekly inspections were held in an attempt to make the camp as livable and as sanitary as possible. Rooms were kept orderly, cobwebs and dust were cleaned away, but there was always some people who could not be forced to be clean." Unquote. The American nurses were kept busy working in the hospital, cooking and cleaning alongside the other inmates of their families, and collecting precious food. Food rapidly became the main topic of conversation among the internees, for there was never enough to feed nearly 4,000 men, women, and children. For the first couple of years, the Japanese civilian administration allowed the prisoners to supplement their diet by visiting local native markets and allowing some Filipino traders into the camp practically every day. Allotments were also laid out to grow vegetables, though some of the campus grounds were taken up by shanties, as there was insufficient space inside the university buildings to house all of the internees. Lieutenant Palmer described how our group was the envy of the whole camp when one day we ate corn off the cob grown in our own camp garden. Internee Hattie Brantley recalled, "We were so hungry that when we ate a banana, we ate the skin too." There were good and bad aspects to life as an internee inside Santo Tomas. Until the Japanese army took over the running of the camp, the administration was fairly relaxed, and there was no abuse by the guards. Quote, "They didn't bother with us very much as long as we went about our business and did not attempt to communicate with the outside or break their curfew regulations," Palmer observed. Education courses were organized, as the camp population contained many professors, priests, and teachers, and a full program of classes ran through 3 semesters each year, plus the summer vacation. Subjects as diverse as philosophy, English literature, sociology, history, music, and languages were offered. Extracurricular activities flourished while the food situation held up in the beginning, and there was baseball. The commandant was a pitcher in the camp's softball league, golf, symphony concerts, and lectures. Full stage productions were managed, such as at Christmas 1943 when The Messiah was performed with a 100-voice choir and a large orchestra. However, some of the internees, both male and female, were determined to continue to play a part in the war, and it was these brave souls who risked the wrath of the Japanese occupation forces by their clandestine activities. One major problem that faced the U.S. Army nurses at Santo Tomas was the lack of money with which to trade for food and other goods. Before their capture on Corregidor in 1942, the American High Command had ordered the nurses to destroy all of the paper currency they were carrying to prevent it being looted by Japanese troops. Inside Santo Tomas, those internees who had money were considerably better off than those without, as the camp authorities tolerated a thriving black market. The nurses survived by signing IOUs to the local representatives of major American corporations, such as General Electric. After liberation, each of the nurses was called upon to pay their IOUs in full, and each received a bill of over $1,000. Throughout the Philippines, the Kempeitai Japanese military police began controlling and hoarding rice, deliberately causing serious malnutrition and starvation among their prisoners. In this, the Japanese military had little choice, as the U.S. Navy's very effective blockade of Japan meant that the troops garrisoning the Philippines could no longer be properly supplied by Tokyo and were forced to rely on local produce. With the introduction of military authority over the civilian prisoners, instances of abuse and murder also increased. Although none of the prisoners was killed by the Japanese inside Santo Tomas, plenty were removed and killed elsewhere. When the Japanese were rounding up American troops immediately after the general's surrender, many changed out of their uniforms and into civilian clothing, and were instead interned alongside genuine American civilians at Santo Tomas. A large group was betrayed to the Japanese by a fellow soldier who was also in hiding, with dire consequences for all those involved. The American informer was angry at the camp's American-British committee, made up of fellow prisoners, and ordered him to stop renting out a small area to inmates seeking temporary privacy. The term temporary privacy was a euphemism for sex. A small group of young female internees had turned to prostitution in order to earn funds to purchase extra food, and the committee wanted this stopped. The disgruntled pimp gave up 35 American soldiers to the Japanese, who immediately had them handed over to the sadistic Kempeitai. By way of thanks, the Kempeitai also arrested their informer and removed him as well. None of these men was ever seen alive again after being driven off to the Kempeitai torture center located at Fort Santiago in Manila. At Santo Tomas, at least the camp had clean running water. The Americans made every effort to stay clean, though soap was a precious commodity. The women either let their hair grow long, or wore it in braids or a bun, or cropped it short to save on soap. Food, or the acquisition of it, dominated the inmates' lives. Some selected prisoners were able to visit the local markets, and some Filipinos were permitted to enter the camp, but the food situation deteriorated slowly as the Japanese steadily decreased the rations that they issued daily. In December 1943, the Japanese issued a single shipment of Red Cross parcels to the prisoners, the only time that they did this. Quote, "There was a food kit, medical supplies, clothes, and badly needed shoes," said Palmer. The next day there were 15 kit casualties, as the doctors termed it, from eating the chocolate bars. Unquote. Efforts were made to create a store of canned goods, but this proved impossible because of the huge numbers of prisoners. Luxuries were carefully preserved. Quote, "Coffee grounds were dried and used over and over again until it scarcely colored the water in which it boiled," recalled Rita Palmer. The prisoners also began to notice that the war was starting to come their way once again. Increased American air activity over Manila, including several air raids, caused the Japanese to close the main gate to the camp permanently in January 1944. Thereafter, the prisoners would have to survive on a steadily decreasing Japanese ration of rice, as no more supplies of fresh food could be brought into the camp legally. The only way to obtain fresh food was through contacts in the Philippine underground movement. Quote, "When it seemed as if conditions could be no worse, the Japs would take more food from them. Each one dipped into his supply of stored goods," Palmer noted. Thus, when the real emergency arrived, nothing was left to eat. Unquote. The prisoners took to novel ways to obtain food. Palmer remembered how. Quote, "One day a pig escaped from the Japanese-owned pen and ran in among the shanties on the grounds of Santo Tomas. Strangely enough, it disappeared instantly without making a squeal. The Japs could never understand what had happened to it and searched for it diligently. They never learned that some of the men living in the shanties fed the pig sodium amytal tablets, and when the pig was sufficiently doped, it was killed." Unquote. Since their incarceration had commenced, many of the internees at Santo Tomas in Manila had also maintained covert communications with Filipino friends outside the wire, in a similar manner to those in many other ghettos and camps throughout occupied Asia. Food, medicines, and news were smuggled into the camp with the help of the Filipino resistance, but several internees paid the ultimate price for their efforts to save lives. In January 1944, the Kempeitai arrested 3 female missionaries and immediately removed them from Santo Tomas to their headquarters at Fort Santiago. The 3 women were Dr. Hawthorne Darby and Helen Wilk, who had jointly run the Emmanuel Cooperative Hospital in Manila before the Japanese invasion, and the Reverend Mary Stagg, minister at the Cosmopolitan Church in Manila. Darby, Wilk, and Stagg were horrifically tortured for nearly 8 months by the Kempeitai, before finally executed by firing squad on the 28th of August 1944. Hunger drove some people to extreme lengths at Santo Tomas. Stealing among the prisoners increased dramatically, leading the camp committee to take steps to punish those who were caught. Extracurricular activities dropped off as vitamin deficiency diseases like beriberi and scurvy increased. Quote, some people became panic-stricken and ate boiled hibiscus leaves or cats, but the doctors soon put a stop to this, for those people became very sick. However, a large flock of pigeons that had nested in the eaves gradually disappeared. Unquote. The Japanese cut the rice ration from 3 servings a day to only 2. Lumps appeared under the skin caused by the starchy diet, Palmer noted. Hands and feet became swollen, and it was with great difficulty that the people climbed stairs to their rooms. A few of the elderly internees actually died of starvation, but fortunately the children fared a little better. Quote, during the periods when the Japs were dining, the children would hang around the table. When they could not stand it any more, they would toss scraps of food from the table to the wide-eyed, hungry children. Unquote. As American air raids increased in ferocity and regularity, the internees were not allowed outside the buildings after dark, and the camp was completely blacked out at night. American pilots sometimes buzzed low over the camp in the daylight in sleek silver P-51 Mustang fighters. They would tip their wings, and the prisoners would cheer wildly as Japanese guards ran around yelling and screaming. Each day at Santo Tomas began in a rather surreal manner. Reveille was sounded at 6:30 a.m., and the Japanese allowed the prisoners to choose which record to play to wake the camp. If there had been an air raid the previous night, pennies from heaven drifted across the camp the next morning, and this became a source of laughter and jokes among the internees. If no raid had occurred, I'm biding my time was often used. The Japanese eventually wised up to the American sense of humor and banned this particular selection of music. Quote, older in the 3 years of imprisonment, the Japanese could never understand the sense of humor and the laughter of the prisoners, said Palmer. A disgraced group of people who had just lost face surely had nothing to be happy about, but the Americans maintained their sense of humor the entire time. Unquote. It was an example of the deep cultural divide between Eastern and Western peoples that was such an important feature of the war in Asia and contributed so much to the attitude of the Japanese towards their prisoners. At 8 a.m., Tenko was sounded, which was roll call, and the prisoners were required to parade before their accommodation and bow to the Japanese as they passed by on inspection. This too was treated with some mirth by the Americans, who exaggerated their bows in mock obedience to their Japanese masters. The American nurses at Santo Tomas tried to hold on to a sense of solidarity and camaraderie among themselves, if only to reinforce their often flagging morale. Rita Palmer observed, every occasion for a celebration was grasped. The birthdays and anniversaries of the members of each one's family far away in the United States or some country were duly fated with a special tablecloth and a cake baked in an oven, which one of the internees called a flower pot stove, for it looked very similar to an inverted flower pot. As clothes wore out and fell to pieces, the women became experts in scrounging material to produce new clothing. Blue denim was particularly prized for its durability. Each person had to fashion his own clothes, design, cut, and sew by hand. One of the men made bamboo knitting needles for the women, and the women knitted and crocheted underwear and socks. G-strings were worn more often than any other article of underwear by both men and women, for they were easy to make and cool and comfortable to wear. Shoes were replaced by bakis, wooden soles tied with hemp strings to hold them to the foot. In late December 1944, one of the female Italian prisoners at Santo Tomas Camp in Manila, Mrs. J.D. Manciarini, was arrested by the Kempeitai and hauled off to Fort Santiago. Manciarini, who was a nurse, was a major contact with the Filipino underground outside Santo Tomas and was part of a ring of prisoners who were helping to keep their fellow inmates alive by arranging for food and medicines to be smuggled into the camp. Any connection to the Filipino resistance was viewed by the Kempeitai as terrorist activity, and therefore part of a vast anti-Japanese plot to undermine the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, as they called their slave empire. Death was the usual punishment after months of inhuman torture to extract a confession, real or false. Under extreme duress, Mencharini gave the Japanese 3 names. Kempeitai troops soon had the 3 men picked from the camp, along with another American who was completely innocent, and dragged off to their torture chambers. The most prominent among the arrested was Carroll C. Grinnell, a New Yorker who had been working for General Electric in the Philippines before being interned. He had recently been elected chairman of the camp's American-British Committee. Alongside Grinnell was A.F. Duggleby, a 55-year-old mining executive from California, and 60-year-old Ernest E. Johnson, U.S. Maritime Commission representative in Manila. Finally, the innocent man among them, Clifton Carson, who was a young engineer from Los Angeles, was also picked up. The 4 men and Mrs. Mencharini were later executed and their bodies dumped in a shallow grave. The new military commandant of Santo Tomas, Lieutenant Colonel Toshio Hayashi, cut the food ration quite severely during the final months of the war. American nurse Madeline Ullum recalled that towards the end, everybody was sick. There was beriberi, starvation, scurvy. As American forces advanced towards the Philippines, each Allied success caused more suffering for the prisoners. Every time the United States took back an island, our rations were cut, said one. The end, when it came for the internees at Santo Tomas, was unexpectedly dramatic and bloody. The inmates at Santo Tomas Camp heard the joyful news that American forces had finally landed on Luzon. Lieutenant General Walter Kruger's U.S. 6th Army had come ashore at Lingayen Gulf on the 9th of January 1945. General Douglas MacArthur had promised that the Americans would return following his defeat in 1942, and return they did with unprecedented firepower and determination. Manila was MacArthur's priority target. Fortunately, the Japanese had done very little to prevent invading American forces from advancing rapidly towards the city. The main American columns set out from the beachheads and found only intact bridges and shallow rivers to cross. But the Japanese were prepared to make the Americans fight for every inch of Manila. If necessary, street by street and house by house, Manila would become the Stalingrad of the war in Asia. On the 3rd of February, elements of the U.S. 1st Cavalry Division, commanded by Major General Vern D. Mudge, entered the northern suburbs of Manila, seizing a vital bridge across the Tuliahan River, the water feature that separated American forces from the city proper. Japanese defenses had been laid out to cover both sections of the city, a demarcation line running along the Pasig River through the heart of Manila. The Imperial Japanese Navy had been ordered to defend the city to the last man and the last bullet, while Lieutenant General Tomoyuki Yamashita had withdrawn most of the army troops from the city and retreated to the mountains. Under the command of Rear Admiral Sanji Iwabuchi, 20,000 Japanese soldiers and sailors were dug in throughout the city and were prepared to contest every street and building with the Americans. The fight for Manila became one of the great street-fighting epics of the Second World War, rivaling Berlin in its ferocity and destruction. Manila, once described as the Pearl of the Orient, with 300 years of Western architectural heritage centered around the mini-Vatican City at its heart, known as the Intramuros, was utterly destroyed. Although much of the city has been reconstructed, many of the original buildings are gone forever. The American drive to liberate Manila and the fierce Japanese resistance also resulted in a human tragedy of appalling scale and brutality. The city's defenders took out their frustrations as they began to lose the battle on the local civilian population, and in an orgy of rape and murder as monstrous as that caused in the Chinese capital Nanjing in 1937, Japanese troops deliberately tortured and murdered as many innocents as they could lay their hands on. It was Manila's Götterdämmerung and the Japanese Navy's darkest hour of the war. All during internment, the prisoners received news from the outside world by word of mouth, said Lieutenant Rita Palmer. One of the male internees had a small radio that he managed to keep hidden from the Japanese from the duration. Of course, this news became greatly exaggerated according to the temperament of the person that passed it along, said Palmer. Consequently, the internees at Santo Tomas believed that they would be liberated long before they actually were, and as they waited, many came to believe that the Philippines was going to be bypassed by the Americans and China invaded instead. When the Americans landed on Luzon, the Filipinos living close to the walls of the camp became very daring and turned the volume of their radios on very high so that the internees might hear the news inside the camp. At Santo Tomas, the Japanese were getting nervous as the Americans rapidly approached. "We had to give back our garden tools," said Lieutenant Ullum. "There were fires in the commandant's office where they were burning up things." With a bridge secured over the Tuliahan River, the first American unit into Manila proper was a squadron of Brigadier General William Chase's 8th Cavalry Brigade, which drove straight into the massive internment camp. A P-38 Lightning aircraft had overflown the camp and dropped a message to the inmates which read, "Roll out the barrel. There will be a hot time in the old town tonight." Rita Palmer was laid up in the hospital when the Americans unexpectedly arrived on the 3rd of February. Palmer was suffering from dysentery and malnutrition, as well as recovering from a bout of malaria, and she dragged herself to a window to watch the liberation unfolding. Quote, "One night word spread through the hospital that a houseboy had sent a note in a coffin into the camp," recalled Palmer of the impending rumors of liberation doing the rounds of the camp before the Americans rolled up to the main gate. It said, "Dear sir, please be careful. I think there will be trouble tonight." Unquote. Palmer and many of the other internees were apprehensive lest lightly armed Filipino resistance fighters might attempt to liberate the camp, as they would have been no match for the heavily armed Japanese. Then that night, machine gun fire was heard, said Palmer. Bright lights of the flares and the searchlights were seen. Then came the sound of American voices as the American soldiers rode the tanks up to the gates to liberate the prisoners from starvation as well as the Japs. Unquote. Chase's men broke into the camp at 9 p.m. and fought the guards at the main gate, a Sherman tank pushing the gates aside as it nosed into the main courtyard with its searchlight blazing. Placed under pressure, the commandant, Lieutenant Colonel Hayashi, retreated with his 46 remaining men and a large contingent of internees to the education building, where they holed up. Some Japanese were separated from Hayashi's group. The prisoners began streaming out of the buildings and shanties as American infantrymen fanned out inside the perimeter. "We all walked out," recalled Ullum. "The captain of the Japanese guards came out too. He reached in his shirt pocket for a grenade. He was going to kill us all. They shot him right in the neck." Unquote. Ullum may be referring to a Japanese officer who rushed out in front of the American tank brandishing a drawn sword and a pistol. He had been shot down immediately and wounded in the stomach. Groaning and writhing on the ground, he was seized by the legs and dragged to the main building clinic, internees kicking and spitting at him, one or two men even slashing him with knives, and some women burning him with cigarettes as he was pulled past them. The Japanese officer died later in the infirmary, but not before receiving medical treatment from the American soldiers. Local Japanese forces turned their guns on the camp when they realized American forces had invested most of the compound. Artillery fire rained down for several minutes, scattering prisoners and liberators alike. Japanese gunfire killed 22 unfortunate internees who had waited so long for liberation, and wounded a further 39. When the firing ceased, some Japanese still remained in control of part of the camp, and they were holding hostages. Demanding that he and his men be allowed safe passage to join Japanese troops in the south of the city, Colonel Hayashi threatened to slaughter his hostages unless the Americans agreed to his terms. On the 5th of February, the Americans did reluctantly agree, and the hostages were freed. After exchanging salutes, the Japanese were escorted out of the main gate through a phalanx of stony-faced American soldiers. As chance would have it, Hayashi and his men went to the area around the Malacanang Palace, already occupied by American forces, and in the fighting, Hayashi and many of his men were killed. The rest ended up back at Santo Tomas as prisoners of war themselves. During over 3 years of imprisonment at Santo Tomas, over 10% of the prison population had died, mostly from disease and malnutrition, deliberately engineered by the Japanese. The total figure was 466 men, women and children, out of 4,255 imprisoned there. Although conditions for the prisoners were considerably better than the deliberate sadism dished out to military prisoners of war taken by the Japanese, it must be remembered that the internees in Santo Tomas and dozens of other camps across Asia were civilians whose only crime was to have been living in the Far East when the Japanese invaded. The treatment meted out to civilian internees by the Japanese military was far in excess of the conditions suffered by Allied military prisoners of the Germans. "You just wonder how you possibly did it," said Ullum after the war. Ullum continued to serve in the U.S. Army after the war, reaching the rank of lieutenant colonel before retiring in 1964. Both Rita Palmer and Ullum were awarded the Purple Heart, along with many other nurses, at a special ceremony at the White House in 1945. And Ullum received the Bronze Star in 1985, 40 years after her liberation. Thanks for listening. Please visit my video channel, Mark Felton Productions. You can also help to support both of my channels at PayPal and Patreon. Details in the description box below.